I'll never forget the night my best friend Danny and I decided to explore the old St. Willard Asylum. It's one of those places you hear about in urban legends, the ones people swear are haunted, the ones where people claim they've seen things no one would ever believe. St. Willard was a crumbling, decaying shell on the edge of a forgotten town, and it had been abandoned for decades. Its past was filled with tragedy and secrets, a mental hospital that had been the center of unspeakable experiments and rumors of patients vanishing without a trace. Locals said that if you stayed there past nightfall, you'd never come back. But to us, those warnings were nothing more than a challenge. Danny and I were amateur ghost hunters, and like most thrill seekers, we were driven by a need to capture something truly terrifying, something that would make our names. And St. Willard was the kind of place that promised exactly that. We arrived just before sunset, our car rattling as it came to a stop in the gravel parking lot. The asylum loomed before us, its broken windows and crumbling walls casting twisted shadows across the ground. The wind whistled through the hollowed-out building, making it sound like it was breathing, like it was alive and waiting. We grabbed our gear, flashlights, cameras, and a couple of recorders to capture any EVP or electronic voice phenomena, just in case we managed to find something. As we stood at the entrance, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. This was no ordinary building. It seemed to be watching us, waiting for us to make the first move. The air inside was thick, damp, and reeked of mold and decay. Every step we took echoed through the empty halls, each sound magnified by the silence. The asylum had been stripped bare over the years, but remnants of its past lingered in every corner. Rusted bed frames, broken medical equipment, and faded patient files scattered across the floor. As we walked through the main corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker and dance just out of sight, and the creaking of the old building made it feel as though something was following close behind. We started exploring the patient rooms on the first floor. Each room was a tiny, depressing cell with a small window and a metal bed frame. Some of the rooms had writing on the walls, desperate messages scrawled by patients who had likely been forgotten by the world. In one room, the words "Help me" were scratched into the paint over and over, the letters growing more jagged and frantic as they filled the wall. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the fear and despair that had been etched into them so long ago. It was like a silent scream from the past, echoing through the years. Danny was braver than me, always the first to push forward into the darkness, always the first to laugh off the eerie sounds and shadows. He led the way down a long corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The air grew colder as we walked, and I could feel a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. We both started to notice a strange sound, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but it filled the silence in a way that made my skin crawl. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway, and Danny gave me a look that said, "Are you ready?" I nodded, though every part of me wanted to turn back. Beyond those doors lay the basement, the place where, according to legend, the worst of the asylum's horrors had occurred. No one knew what was down there. The few people who had explored it had never returned, or so the stories went. But we were here for proof, and proof lay in the darkest corners of the building. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, each step creaking under our weight. The smell of damp and rot grew stronger as we descended, and the darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping around us like a shroud. By the time we reached the bottom, our flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the shadows. The walls were lined with pipes, some of them leaking a thick, dark liquid that smelled faintly metallic. It was like stepping into another world, a place where light and hope didn't exist. We followed the corridor, our footsteps echoing down the empty hall. At one point, we came across an old examination room, its door slightly ajar. Inside, there was a rusted metal table and cabinets filled with dusty jars containing what looked like body parts. I could see something floating in one of the jars, a distorted shape that might have been a heart or a lung, preserved in a murky yellowish liquid. The sight made my stomach turn, and I had to look away, but Danny was fascinated. He leaned in, muttering about how we'd finally found the evidence we needed. That was when we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the far end of the corridor. We froze, straining to hear. It was a slow, dragging noise, like someone or something was moving toward us. Danny's grip on his flashlight tightened, his knuckles white. He whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the room. We pressed ourselves against the wall, holding our breath as the shuffling passed by the door. Through the crack in the door, I caught a glimpse of something, a dark, hunched figure, its head lolling to one side, as if its neck had been broken. The figure paused, its head twisting slightly, as if it could sense our presence. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure moved on, disappearing into the shadows. Danny and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with terror. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. We stepped back into the corridor, moving as quietly as possible, but every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The shuffling had faded, but I could still feel its presence lurking somewhere nearby. As we made our way through the basement, we began to notice things. Strange symbols scratched into the walls, like some kind of ancient language. Some of the symbols looked almost ritualistic, as if they were meant to summon or contain something dark and terrible. I ran my fingers over one of the markings, feeling a strange energy radiating from it, like a faint electric shock. Suddenly, we heard a door slam somewhere in the distance, followed by a low, guttural growl that echoed through the halls. We turned, shining our flashlights down the corridor, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with horror that it was coming from behind us. We turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the floor as the growling grew closer, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. We stumbled into a large open room that looked like an old operating theater. Rows of seats rose up around us, and at the center of the room was a metal table, stained with dark, rusty marks. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows waiting for us to let our guard down. Danny whispered, "Let's get out of here," and I couldn't agree more. But as we turned to leave, we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the theater. A cold chill washed over me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was there, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. Then, the lights flickered on, casting a sickly greenish glow over the room. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, filling me with an indescribable terror. Danny grabbed my arm and we ran, not daring to look back. The footsteps followed us, growing louder and faster as we raced through the halls, desperate to find our way out. We finally burst through the doors and into the night, gasping for breath. But even as we stumbled to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced back at the asylum, and in one of the windows, I saw it. The shadowy figure watching us, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. We sped away, leaving the asylum behind, but the memory of that night still haunts me. To this day, I don't know what we saw in the basement of St. Willard Asylum, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left forgotten, and some horrors are better left unseen.